Hello, my happy gang on a Thursday. Hi to everyone. So who's on? Bruce is back. Bruce is on time. That's I think you've been late for the last few times, Bruce. I'm not sure. But anyway, welcome back. Earl's on, Robert's on, Andrew Searson is on. That's probably because he's missing me from our pub quizzes. Um, so Alan's on, still up in Australia. Cool. Still wide awake. What else we got? Jeff is on. Cool. Richard, Pablo, David, Ken, all the usuals, and some other people. Serge is on, and now I know I say your name correctly, which is good. Bo is online. Jerry's online. Hey, Jerry. And JD's there too. Cool. So let's have a bit of an introduction. So for those of you that are new to this, this is about an hour's worth of editing that we're going to do with your pictures that you've sent in into Capture One. Capture One being the raw editor, so we don't go into depth in terms of stuff you can do with pixel editors like Photoshop or Affinity and so on. However, we'll go as far as we can with these pictures and try and get them to a place where they look a little bit more enhanced, but not unreal. That's the key thing here. Bruce, you get a special pass. You've been watching on YouTube without logging in. Sneaky, cool. Let's get started first of all then with the version that we're using of Capture One. So that version that you can see on your screen is 13.1.2 or 20.1.2, depending on whether you're looking at the website or the About page on your software. Marketing issue, don't worry about it, it's the same thing. But essentially, version 13 or version 20.1.2 is the version with the latest features on it, but also has two bug releases or service packs since then, hence the point 2 at the end. Okay, so next up, before we go into Capture One itself, a couple of things I want to cover. So the first is we've had quite a few questions from people about the difference between catalogs and sessions. So David Grover and I had a chat this morning, and we are going to do a bit of a catalogs versus sessions session. Bit of a tongue twister, but there we go. So we're trying to work out exactly when, because obviously his schedule has to fit in with my schedule, and we've got to make sure that we can broadcast at the same time. We're going to do it as interactive as we can, which means it might be a slightly different format to this, because I'd like it to be more of a discussion and more of a problem solve for some of your queries that you've got with catalogs versus sessions. So effectively, there are two ways of operating with management of your files in Capture One. One is with a catalog, the other is with a session. Sometimes you can mix them, so you can create a catalog from your sessions, for example, and hence people get a bit confused. But in essence, there are two main ways and two different ways that you can do your editing or control your files in Capture One, and quite a few people have questions about which is the best for their particular scenario. So David and I will host a session probably over the next week or so. If you keep an eye out in the Facebook group, we will announce where it is and the link to it and so on, and how you can get access to it. Obviously, the more people that are there, the more difficult it gets to be interactive. So we may look at different ways of doing this. However, we will do it as a dedicated session. Oh, bad word, but a dedicated broadcast about catalogs and sessions, so we don't get bogged down to it or into it when we're actually trying to edit the photos. Okay. Next up, while we're on the subject of the Facebook group, and this actually hurts me the fact that we're going to talk about this. However, for the first time today, we've actually ended up either losing some members or I've had to delete some people from the Facebook group. Let me explain why. So we created a small little community. The idea is that you can share ideas, you can share questions, share answers. And what's great to see in that Facebook group is people asking things like, where can I get my prints done at high quality? Or I've got a problem with trying to undo something, or catalogs and sessions, all that sort of stuff. And people are bundling in and helping each other. And also we can give some steer in terms of what will be fixed and what won't be fixed, and what's just a way of working and so on in that group. Now, as you know, all of the stuff that we do online is no charge, no fee. We don't do any of that stuff to make a profit out of it. But that also means that it cannot become an overhead. So at the point in time where I start becoming a full-time moderator of stuff, it just doesn't work. So I get the most out of Facebook groups and other online forums when they're interactive, but they're also respectful of each other, and they're also on topic. What I don't want that group to turn into, and what we did see, and the reason why you'll see some changes in that group, is people coming in for either a drive-by showcase. In other words, splatter all your photos all over the group and hope that people like it in a way of showcasing. Um, we don't want rants, random conspiracy rants about how the world is against everyone and so on. I'm sorry, that stuff just detracts from the whole point of people wanting to spend time in that group and working with each other to try and fix things or try and talk about things that they can improve their photography with. It's a photography group, but it needs to be interactive and it needs to be inclusive when it comes to asking questions and when it comes to improving stuff and so on. So yeah, funnily enough, as as Chili's just said, just don't do social media at all to begin with. I'm sort of on that page. However, social media can be fantastic, and actually, as a result, I know, well, weirdly, I don't know you, but I know quite a few of you through here, and that's great. Actually, one good thing that's come out of lockdown is hopefully you guys have learned some stuff, and I've been able to interact with people that I wouldn't even know before. And it's great to see all the stuff that you guys are contributing and the pictures you're sending in, and it's fantastic. But it has to be something that people get value out of, and the way we make sure people get value out of is make sure that people are respectful of, frankly, the rules or the framework, and we try and keep it really light. But please use the groups respectfully of each other's time, and that's it. So that's it. That's all we're going to say about that. And anyway, let's go on to Capture One itself. So as I say, I'm just going to go back. So reminder, we're going to do that session on catalogs versus sessions over the next week or so with David. He and I will host something that's a bit more interactive than this, hopefully. And we can talk about the exact same question that seems to come up quite a lot around which is the best thing for me to use in my situation. So YouTube Jerry, there we go. You hit the nail on the head. One of the many reasons I don't do Facebook. The reason we broadcast on YouTube is because of Jerry. So well done, Jerry. There we go. So right, let's go into Capture One. So let's load up our software. So here we go, Capture One. Most of you are familiar with this interface, but general terms, folder structure, and I use a catalog for these sessions. Again, we'll talk about that later. Folder structure on the left hand side, we've got filters if we wanted them to sort our images and keywords and tags and so on. Main image in the middle, which is our editing space, and then our browser on the right hand side. If I want to hide or show any of those elements, all I do is go to my view menu and I can say, oh, do I want to see the viewer, do I want to see the browser? Some people have been asking questions about these labels down the bottom and these labels here. The way you control whether those labels are visible or not is just this tick box here. So if you don't want these labels down here about the image to be visible, take it off. It gives you a bit more space for editing for a start. In the browser, the same thing. You can turn the labels only into status mode. You can turn them off completely. You can choose to place the browser below your images down here. A lot of people ask, can I move it to the side or not? Really, really easy. So genuinely do play with the view menu and customize your workspace in a way that really, really works for you. It's the end of the day, it's your workspace, it's not Capture One's. They give you a default, but that doesn't mean you've got to stick with it. So, Chili, before we get started then, so for the catalogs versus sessions talk, have you tried separating out the caching from the catalog to an external drive, something to look into? We'll talk about it. We'll cover that in terms of where's the best place to store your images versus the catalog data. Because remember, the catalog data itself is a database that also includes previews and stuff like that. So all of that sort of stuff. And JD, yeah, one too many conspiracy theories for me on social, yeah, agreed. So let's look at this picture. So cool picture by Peter. Don't worry, Claudio, I haven't forgotten you. I said we'd start with yours, but I just want to switch it into this one first, and then we'll come on to your little street scene as well. So image here with the lens profile loaded in. I've seen a few people ask questions recently about lens profiles and how you can edit your own or add your own. The answer is you can't. Sorry. So if your lens exists in the database and Capture One has read it in the metadata, then it will load in automatically. If it doesn't load in automatically, think about maybe that exact model of lens isn't there. If it is there, then you're sure about it, be sure. Then you can manually select it in here, because sometimes the metadata doesn't come across cleanly. So make sure you choose it in here. Or if you've got a manufacturer profile, which is basically the camera embedding that lens data into the raw file, you can choose that too. If you can't find the lens and you can't find the manufacturer profile, don't just pick a random one, stick with generic, because a random one may give you a poor result at the end unless you've tested it. Okay. So correct profile loaded in. We might have a bit of diffraction at f8. I'm not too sure that we will, but let's just turn that on. Hopefully that sharpens us up a little bit. This lens, strangely, for a lens at 180 millimeters, has actually got quite a lot of distortion, which I was surprised at. But Capture One's profile for this lens has automatically loaded in 100% distortion correction. I'm not worried about losing stuff off the sides. So in previous ones, we've talked about it, the fact that with the distortion correction, you can lose some of your data off to the sides because of the crop. Well, on this shot, we're not too worried. It's not necessarily a problem out on the sides. So a couple of questions just came in. One from Claudia saying I'm watching like a hawk. Yep, you're up next, don't worry. And then Bjorn, unfortunately the default is that the info is not visible in the browser and you always have to turn it on. It'd be great to have that configurable. I didn't know that it wasn't, to be honest, Bjorn. Sometimes if you make the browser really, really small, or sorry, the thumbnail size really small in the browser, you can end up with, let me just go on to here, no labels here. So if you have your browser at the bottom, this magnifying bar always appears. If it doesn't, you can go to this little plus thing up here. And when it gets so small, basically you can't fit the file name on. So what Capture One does is it automatically hides the labels. If you make it bigger, then you'll see the labels appear. So I think it is actually on by default, but you might find that your previews or your little browser images are a little bit too small. In the thumbnail view, is there any way to display the file size? Not that I know of, David. I think you're actually pretty limited in what you can display in that thumbnail view. It's basically, I think, file only. I mean, yeah, we'll talk about it another session. I think we need to do probably as a group a bit of a session about workspace and how we set them up and what's available. But to my knowledge, no. What you would do is you'd have something like a filter, and that would be it. Sorry, Bjorn. You meant the viewer, not the browser. Yeah, it may. To be honest, I don't know. I've had my workspace set up for so long that I've always had it down there. It may be by default, and in reality, actually, by not showing it, you do get a bit more space for editing. Your photos get a bit bigger. We use them on here so that you can see things like the aperture and the ISO when we're talking about noise, but it may be that, for every one person that wants it defaulted on, there's probably another person that wants it defaulted off. But yeah, to be honest, I'll have a chat with David and ask him if there's anything that can be looked at in terms of configuring it, sorry. But as it stands, I've always had my workspace set up like this effectively. Okay, so lens profile loaded in. I'm not too worried about sharpness fall off because in reality the sharpness is pretty even across this lens. So remember, sharpness fall off is only useful if you've got a lens that's soft at the edges and sharp in the middle. Sharpness fall off only affects the outside area of the lens. It doesn't necessarily affect the inside. So if you've got the same sharpness here as you do out here, which we do in this case, there's going to be no benefit to doing that. If anything, you could end up with some artifacts you don't want. And light fall off, well, that's the opposite of what we want here, right? Because if I start turning that up, and it's not going to have much of an effect on this lens profile anyway, but what I don't want to do is increase the light on the outside of this image. We want to keep the focus on the fireworks themselves. Okay, so we could go into our color range here and do all of our color editing, but actually I'm pretty comfortable with the colors as they are. We don't, fireworks are artificial color by nature. We're blowing up chemicals to make different colors. So we don't really want to be changing that. It's got to be respectful of what was actually on display. So great. Let's just switch then instead to our normal tab that we use. So the tab that you're going to use, as I say before, for sort of 80% of your time is the exposure tab. It's the one that looks like the histogram up here, now in orange, and that's got most of our tools out of the box. Now, if you've customized your workspace and the way that you do that, click on the pins up here, or the three little pins up here. Oops, sorry. With the right mouse button and go to add tool, you can choose things up here to go into the what's called pinned area. So the pinned area up here doesn't move as I scroll the bottom. Or down here, I can add things. Sorry, we add the tool first. Down here, I can then move those tools into the pinned area, or I can remove it completely. So this is another thing that a lot of people get confused by. So let me add let's add a metadata. tab in here. Okay, so it's gone immediately into the fixed pinned area in Capture One. So as I scroll up and down, I'm scrolling within this tool, but I can't get to any of my other tools down the bottom. The reason is because I'm not scrolling in this area, and it's this rather indescript little line that I know a few people have picked up on. So this line here is the boundary between your pinned area and your movable area, or your scrollable area, as it's called. So I can move tools between these by clicking on this three dots and saying move tool to pinned area, or in a pinned one, click on these three dots and I can move tool to scrollable area. So I can move them around, and when I do, that tool then appears down here in the scrollable area at the bottom. And then from here I can move that tool up and down just by dragging. So when it comes to organizing your workspace, it's actually really configurable. Don't waste the opportunity to create a workspace around your way of shooting. That's key. And I'd really encourage you to try out a different workspace, or a workspace that's wrapped around the tools that you use, and delete the ones that you don't. That's the key thing. Okay. So on this shot, we've got in here obviously a bit of artificial light, so obviously it's looking a little bit yellow here. But I don't want to make it too cool, because if I just do a generic let's make it cool, then that's great, but everything goes just way too blue, which is a massive problem for us. So we don't want that. What we want is something that's neutral on the areas that should be neutral. So let's just reset our white balance here. We know that this wall here should be pretty much white. Now remember, I've talked about this before. Remember that a neutral wall or a neutral color in the image may not be neutral based on the light that's falling on it. So a neutral wall that's grey at sunset does not look grey. It looks a bit orange or red or yellow. So be careful with what you're picking. But in this case, given this cold sort of daylight tone light that's coming out of the firework itself is bouncing off of this wall, if I pick this wall, now we get into actually a pretty neutral tone. It's still yellow up here. In fact, there's a little bit of a green tint, which we'll have a look at. But I know that that wall that should be neutral is now neutral. So if I do it before and after, so there's before, there's after, we've got a little bit more lifelike, a little bit more like it was probably at the time, because I'm pretty sure to the human eye, it didn't look quite that warm. Okay. But now we've got to fix some of this stuff, because actually not only have we still got some yellow in this, we've also got quite a lot of a green tint now, hence the name, green tint. Tint slider goes from green on the left up to magenta on the right. So we can manually now change a little bit of that just to get rid of the green in those tones. Okay. So if I do a before and after, so tool up here on the top right, or I can press the Y key on the keyboard, that gives me my little display. If I don't want the split screen, I can hold down on this tool and say give me full view, but in this case I want to be able to slide. So there's our after, there's our before, just in terms of white balance. Okay. Papu, so do I need to make individual layer for each gradient adjustment we apply, or can we apply more than one gradient adjustment in one layer? Good, on topic. So a couple of weeks ago, I tried to be clever on camera and it backfired immensely. So the answer is no, you have to have one, sorry, let me correct that. You can have a gradient layer that is rasterized, and then you can add to it and you can erase from it and so on one layer. And you can edit that gradient once it's rasterized too. But the second you draw a gradient on a layer, it will remove any existing mask on that layer. Something that is, in my view, a bit of a pain. So just bear that in mind. At the moment, as it stands, within Capture One, you have to have one gradient on one layer. If you want a different gradient, so let's say you've got one gradient going this way and you want another gradient going that way, those two gradients mean that actually you'd need two different layers. So the two different layers need to sit one on top of each other. Bear in mind you're going to have some overlap on those two gradients as well. But if I went back to layer one, let's say, and tried to draw another gradient, even if it wasn't a gradient on there, even if it was just a paintbrush on there, the second I draw a gradient, it's going to obliterate everything else on the layer and it's going to replace the mask with that gradient. So be careful. Okay, so here's our neutral-ish colored city versus our previous one, which is a little bit too warm. Okay. So with that, let's have a look at what we can do to bring out some detail down here, but we don't want to bring out the detail up here, or I say detail, I don't want to bring out the shadows up here. So let's think about using our histogram. So histogram up here on the left-hand side. As I move my mouse around the image, you can see that orange bar, and we've talked about this a lot for you guys that have been on regularly, but let's do it again just to drum it in. So the orange bar is one of the most useful things that you can find in Capture One. And by orange bar, I mean the bar that appears up here on the histogram as I move around. So you see it sort of flitting around. The reason is I'm going across the fireworks. It's going bright, dark, and so on. If I go down here into this area on the building, we can see that these buildings are sat very much in the highlights area of the histogram. This stuff here is sat in the very top end of the histogram, also known as white on the high dynamic range scale. So we've got highlights here and we've got white here. Okay. Now, what about the shadows? Well, down here, these roofs, even though they look relatively bright, in the picture, in actual fact, they sit very clearly in the shadows. So as I move around this roof over here, we can see that orange bar on the left hand side. Anything in the bottom quarter pretty much is considered shadow. And then we've got the sky. So the sky is in that very darkest part of the shadows, and so are these trees down here. Let's just move into here. That very bottom part of shadows is also known as black on the slider. So you've got highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. Whites and blacks sit within highlights and shadows. Highlights and shadows will also affect whites and blacks. Okay. Earl's just said, I don't see any advantage just having two or more grads on one layer. So it can be, so I've done it before where I've had one gradient coming in from this side and one gradient coming from this side. And actually, I've done it on a camera. I've actually done it in camera before using a literal piece of glass neutral density filter. And I've had one filter coming in this way and one filter coming in this way to effectively create almost two linear drops in exposure that give me a weird sort of triangular vignette, but if it's soft enough, it can really give a good effect. So there are some cases where it could be useful. There's another case where maybe you want to darken the sky and the ground by the same amount, but in reality it's no bother really to do that on two separate layers, and actually it gives you some more flexibility later because you might want to change, for example, the white balance a little bit on the ground versus the sky. So sometimes actually having the two is more beneficial than trying to fit them all onto one layer. Okay, so that's where our data sits. Now, knowing that, we can have a look at what we want to do, because if I pull up just blacks, well, I'm going to pull up the sky for a start and pull it up by quite a lot here, but I'm also going to flatten the image. So effectively, by bringing up most of the data in this bottom part of the histogram and bringing it into the shadows, we've just flattened everything that's in the detail itself. So we've lost a load of contrast as a result. Whereas, if I pulled up the shadows by the same amount, we haven't lost as much contrast because we haven't brought up all of the deepest, darkest blacks in isolation. We've brought up all of the shadows and effectively stretched them towards the middle, but the darkest parts have been allowed to sort of stay there because we haven't literally picked up that bottom chunk and just moved it across. So in some ways, in this case, shadows is going to be more useful for us than blacks. And you see this, pulling up the black on this slider here, we just end up with this almost this unreal effect. It doesn't look right. It just looks a little bit washed out and looks a bit fake. So we're not going to use that. We're going to use our shadows, but we don't want to use it on the top part, which is our fireworks, because we want a dark sky. So we know what we want to do. All we're going to do now is create a new layer, call that sky. So double click on a layer name and you get the ability to rename it. And in fact, I'm going to rename it differently. We're going to call it ground. That was a stupid thing for me to do. So I'm going to draw now a gradient layer up from the ground. Now to do that, I just clicked on this little gradient icon here. The second I start drawing, if I didn't already have a layer set in my image, it would have created a brand new adjustment layer for me. Okay. If you pull up, so Claudius just said, if you pull up the blacks or the shadows, can we counterbalance this with a curve? You can, but then I'd argue, you're resetting what you've pulled up. You'd end up in a bit of a seesaw scenario, if you see what I mean. So we've brought them up, but only to then crush them back down with a curve. So you're bringing up shadows to then hide again later on. I'd sort of say I don't know what your output goal is with that. If anything, if you want to do it through curves, absolutely we can do it through curves, and you'll have a much more precise ability to control it, but it's going to take you a lot more time. And in this case, I don't think we necessarily need it. So I've now got a gradient that's 100% here, 100% of this line, 50% of this line, and 0% of this line. The further this line gets away, the softer that gradient fall off is, and the more subtle the change will be. So I'm actually going to do this so we have a subtle fall off, because it actually makes sense that the stuff in the background starts to fade off into shadow anyway. So with that mask, I'm just now going to use that shadow slider and pull up here. We can actually push it quite a bit on this one because it's got a lot of, there's some good data in here. What camera are we on? We're on an A7R3. Cool. Okay, so it's picked up the shadow detail really well. If I zoom in down here, we're at 200%, so being a little bit unfair, but it's done a good job of pretty much noise-free shadows. I mean, it's 10-second exposure, but it's done a nice job. So while we're in actually this low, I'm just going to switch back to our background layer, and I'm going to adjust our sharpening just a little bit. So let's just have a little play. I'm going to pull our sharpening up. Last week we covered this. There's also one of those pro tips on YouTube that covers sharpening specifically. But in this case, I'm just going to pull our threshold down. So more of the image is going to be affected by the sharpening. Pull the sharpening amount up, but pull the radius down a little bit. And that prevents or helps to prevent some of that the black and white or the dark and light halo lines that appear around the edges. But what we've done effectively, if I undo this and redo, it may be very subtle. I hope it's very subtle anyway, but that's without and that's with, and it's just to sharpen up those edges just a little bit. Not a huge amount, but I just want to get them a bit crisper. And actually a byproduct. Remember, the more detail you put up in the shadows, the more the shadows can be seen. So if the shadows had something that was blurry or not quite sharp, you're going to have to fix that when you pull up that detail. Okay. So down with this bottom ground one, I can actually afford to maybe change our white balance even further. So I can actually bring a little bit more tint in and maybe a little bit more of the cooling effect of that the Kelvin adjustment. So that gives us a bit of a split white balance. Be careful with that because it needs to look realistic, but it's a really nice effect if you can get it right. Okay, now in here we've got a little bit of haze. I would say now whether it's haze or whether it's just because we brought up those shadows and we've lost some contrast, but not so much here and not so much here. So I've effectively got a band in here that I want to make more clear. So no prizes for guessing the tool that we're probably going to use, and I'm going to call this clarity band. Not the name of a pop group, it's just the name of what we're going to do. So I'm going to draw, for the sake of this, 100% mask. I'm not too worried because clarity is not going to do any damage to what we're going to do here. Over this section in the middle. This bit down here doesn't need it, and I don't want to push clarity too far in areas which are nice and crisp and clean anyway. But in this area in the middle here, I can now go on to my exposure tab again. And in our clarity tool here, let's do it way up so we can see. So that's too much, just to be clear. So it's too much at the moment. But you see the difference in terms of the presence that middle's got. So there's without and there's with. So we've sort of made everything pop a little bit, which is what clarity is there to do. But it also has an effect of making things look a little bit too animated or drawn. It can do if you do overdo it. So ideally on clarity, you want to be somewhere between 20 and 30 if it's a realistic image. Sometimes on Cityscapes, you'll see me put it up, we'll put it way, way up, and that's personal choice. But in general terms, for most images, you don't want clarity to be pushed much more than 30 on that scale. It will start to look a bit fake. Now, again, we've got this other discrepancy here between this is good down here. This is looking a bit too pink now and a bit too cold. So I'm just going to bring that back up. So here's the fun bit. We're actually playing now with layer on layer on layer. So we've got a background with a white balance for the whole image. We've got a ground section with a white balance for the bottom part of the image. And then in this clarity band here, I've increased the clarity. So we brought up some of the details so you can see more of it. But I've also changed the white balance again on the clarity one so that effectively you've got 3 different white balances in the same image to make it look even. And that's the key thing here. We're not trying to do this so that the picture looks completely unreal. We're trying to do all these changes so that the picture looks evenly illuminated and correct. When you're taking a picture, especially of a city at night, the number of different light sources in that picture means that the white balance sometimes goes all over the place, especially then you throw in a very cold firework display up in the top. So by doing these little changes in sort of 3 sections in the image, we've effectively evened out that white balance to get it feeling a bit more real. Okay. Overall with the image, I can afford to push structure a little bit. And again, structure is more about the edges and the details around things like lines on windows and textures, and especially things like the roofs on a church. So if I just temporarily undo, it looks a bit softer. Let me just do it way up so you can see. So way too much. Don't do it this much ever, but without and with. So where clarity does things for areas, structure does things for edges and textures. But it also, remember, picks up ISO as a texture. So a high ISO image with a lot of noise, you're going to see that texture if you pull up structure too much. So structure, keep it under control. Again, it's a bit like clarity, never really more than 20, 30 at a push, but keep it low. Keep it as low as you can to get the sharpness and the texture that you want, and that's it, no more. Okay, then finally, let's add a new band called Fireworks. And actually what I am going to do before we do that, on the overall background, I'm going to just put a little vignette in. So here, I'm going to change. So by the way, on Capture One, if ever you're looking to print stuff, just bear one thing in mind. When you're looking at a screen with a black background, things can look more vivid than they really are. Things can look brighter than they really are. Compare it to a white background and you'll see what's actually going to come out on the print. So right-click anywhere. Right-click anywhere on the image. White, light, medium, dark, very dark, and black. Those are your choices. Typically, you'd want to go to something like light. White can be really hard on your eyes, but this helps you see effectively whether things are dropping off and where the edges of the image are. If you've got an image which has got lots of black edges, then it helps to be able to see where those edges are. So with our vignette, effectively, the edges were still not quite black, and I can also tell that by moving my mouse around. You see the numbers at the top? That's giving me the RGB values for these areas. You know, 3s and 4s, 0s down here, that's pretty good. 3s and 4s up here, not the end of the world, but I do want them to fall off at the edge of the frame into complete black in an ideal world. But our fireworks, on the other hand, we want to maybe be a bit brighter. So choose my fireworks layer, and let's go on to our brush. And I'm going to just draw very roughly a horrible, horrible, very ugly mask over here. Not one that you would be very proud of if you were being judged on your masking abilities. And with that mask, let's just turn this back to black so we're on the right page. Okay, so with that mask, fireworks react amazingly well to clarity, as do stars. So with our clarity tool in our scrollable area, let's put it all the way up. And you can see that it sort of gave it a bit of a boost, a bit of a contrast pop. So let's just go without and with, and without and with. If you do it too much, as you can see, it can look over the top. You end up enhancing some of the smoke and everything as well. That doesn't help. Remember as well, you've got different modes of clarity. So this is natural. If I switch to punch, you're going to get a higher contrast, but it might have a little bit of, sorry, lost my words. It might have a little bit of an effect on the colors. So punch is basically the neutral clarity setting, but with added saturation. So if you've got stuff that is realistic, or a sunset, or a landscape with genuine earthy colors and stuff like that, punch is going to do some really bad things to your image, so be careful with it. But in the case of fireworks, it's pretty cool. So without and with. So again, we don't want to do it too much because we don't want to lose too much of the detail. But if we push that to maybe 40 or 50, and this is why I was saying, normally on clarity, for the real bits, the houses, the fields, the clouds, never more than 20 to 30, something like that, never more than 30. For things that are more abstract, you can afford to get away with it, and you can push it up a bit more. Finally, final thing. I'm just, yeah, Chili's just said, tend to make my vignettes the dead last thing I do to the image. Yeah, it's personal choice. You can do them to start with. And in this case, because I wanted to know that the corners could go down to that dark, otherwise I was going to have to draw in a mask. It's kind of useful to do it a bit earlier in here. So, second question. Oh, someone's busy on the questions today. That's cool. So, brief explanation. So, if you go onto YouTube, go into our Clarity Pro Tips. you will see it's about clarity, sharpness, and structure. Clarity, structure, and sharpening, I think it's titled. We go into detail, and there's actually a comparison. There's even a chart that you can download that will show you the difference between natural, neutral, punch, and classic in terms of what they each do and the effect it will have on your image depending on what you're editing. So, final one, crop. I am going to crop this image, and I want it to be a 3x4 crop and up to here. The reason being, I like the fact that this is central. I know there's a school of thought that says don't make it central, but when it's something like a firework display over a city down below, it just looks so much cooler when it's framed like that. So this here would be my final image. Let's go to before and after. So here's our before. There's our after. If we don't like how cool the top part has gone with our fireworks, in fact, because we've got this mask on fireworks itself, we could actually play with white balance. Be careful because you might affect the black behind it, but to a certain extent, we could play with white balance a little bit independently of the rest of it. But there's our before, there's our after. A lot more detail in the bottom, not much more noise, but certainly it's sharper. We've got a lot more vibrance, I guess, about all the fireworks up above, and the framing just feels a little bit more considered, as in a print. If I just clone that and reset, if we look at the two side by side. So remember as well, sorry, your before and after tool will show you the before and after, but it will keep the crop as you've made it, and it will keep the keystoning as you've made it to allow you to compare. If you actually want to see literally before and after, you need to either create a clone of the variant or a new variant and look at them side by side. That will show you the actual difference between what was the raw and what was the final image. Okay, so there we go. And while you contemplate that for 2 seconds, I'm just going to have a sip of Coke. Okay, that stopped me coughing. Right, moving on to Claudio's. Okay, promised you we would cover this one, so here we go. Right, so this is obviously village. I'm not sure which village it is, but I'm guessing village in England somewhere. So it's Blue Hour. Effectively, we've got a car street coming down the road. We've got a little bit of a lean on the building. So if you look at, start to do this with your images. Load the image up, and the first thing to do, really, I'm just going to switch that back to black, is to think about, right, what are the things that I would do differently? What were the things that if I had a tilt shift lens, or if I had an infinite ability to get to anywhere in the frame, where would I have placed things, and how would I have composed it? So to me, this lean is a little bit distracting. Sort of feels like it's closing in on us. And actually, the light trail itself is really, really nice. But it's sort of lost a little bit in some of this to me. Now, again, this all depends. So the answer is Whistable. There we go. For those of you that want to go and visit this village or town. So to me, this is personal preference, but I'd like to see a subject to the picture. I like to see details after the main subject, but I don't want to have to be distracted by too many different things if you're trying to show me something in this picture. And what you're trying to show me in here, I believe, is that motion of a car going through a effectively otherwise empty street. So first thing, let's fix our lean. So Keystone tool, this one. Now Keystone comes in 3 different varieties, so vertical, horizontal, and the 4-way Keystone. So 4-way Keystone is really handy for perspective shift and perspective warping. Again, there's one of those pro tips videos. It's about 20 minutes long on YouTube. Have a look at it. It's free, as everything is. But genuinely have a look at that, because it will show you where you can get it right and where you can get it wrong, and why keystoning is so important for some images. Keystone horizontal allows us to fix an image which is going away from us, from either to the left to the right or from the right to the left. When you get, for instance, if you're photographing a bank of a lake, and as the lake disappears off, it's going to appear to get smaller. So keystoning helps us pull that back. Vertical keystone helps us with perspective distortion. So as we look up and down at buildings which are straight, the effect of a wide angle lens, and this is a 12mm lens, is that you get the effect of parallax, which means things either converge or diverge as they get further away from you. So as a result, vertical is the right one for this. One question. So from SuBS57. I don't know. How do I say that? Subs? I don't know. Are certain images better suited to different grids, rectangular golden ratio or Fibonacci spiral? Honestly, no. Um, in my view, again, this is all my view rather than the official line, but then I would argue there is no real official line in this stuff. I've got images which are absolutely on the 1/3 mark. I've got images which work on the spiral. I've got images that work to the golden ratio of, all of that stuff. But every now and then, plonking the subject or smack bang in the middle of the image because it's so dramatic or it's so abstract is the right thing to do. Sometimes having the subject way off to the right hand side or way off to the left, nowhere near a 1/3 line, is the right thing to do with negative space. It's about how you want the picture to feel. So I would argue, no, there isn't a rule and there shouldn't be. It's got to be based on how you want the image to feel. Okay, Claudia, so made a run to capture the car coming in, nearly choking the fish. Yeah, see, this is the stuff that's important. It's the fact that you're eating fish and chips when you're taking the photos. That's the important bit. Okay, so with our vertical keystone tool, all we've got to do is move these 4 little dots to the bits that we want to be vertical. So note, you're not moving them to the bits of the image that are vertical, you're moving them to the bits of the image that you want to be vertical. And ideally you want to do that as far away from the center as possible. Simple reason. If you do it near the center, a tiny little adjustment is going to have a massive effect at the outside. If you do it at the outside, a tiny adjustment is literally that. It's a tiny adjustment. So the nearer to the edge we can get with a straight line, the better for your output. So we can assume, let's say, that this line here, this concrete line here, is pretty much straight. It might not be quite straight if it's an old town, but it's not going to be far off. So I'm drawing 1 dot here, 1 dot here, and we're using the dashed line to get us to the right place. Now on the left, we've got a bit more of a problem, because I can't really see any direct straight line down as nicely as this one has appeared. But just look outside of here. So this image has some distortion correction applied, and hence the crop tool has actually lost some of the outside. But that doesn't stop us being able to use the outside part of the crop for our keystone. So I've got this wonderful little boundary here between these two buildings, and I can approximate where this line needs to go based on this yellow part of this building down here. So we can do that there, that sort of works, and apply. Now note, these two bottom dots here don't have to be anywhere near each other. They can be in completely different places on the image. However, if I'd done it with the 4-way tool, that difference in those two dots would have made a dramatic change to the image, and one that we would really struggle to recover from. So in vertical mode, just worry about the vertical parallax, don't worry about where they are. In horizontal mode, just worry about the horizontal or dashed line, don't worry about where they are vertically. If you're in 4-way mode, you need to make sure that these lines are on horizontal equivalents as well as being on vertical equivalents as they go up. Now, one other thing to check. Look at this, the amount 80. Now, at the very, very beginning, I remember I did a session back in, must be April time, something like that. And I was struggling live online to try and get the keystone working right. And I'd missed the fact that, and actually it's an obvious one for me now looking back on it, but there is a question in my mind as to why it's set to 80, but it is at the moment. So your default on your keystone is set to 80%. What that means is I've told Capture One that I want these lines to be vertical, and it has put them to 80% vertical by default, not 100. So I'm going to go into here and say 100. And as I tab out, you're going to see that image shifted a little bit, and it's now gone to make sure those lines are 100%. One of the schools of thought is that specifically for things like landscapes and so on, sometimes, and actually even when you're doing an aerial shoot, sometimes that perspective looking down on things is important. So 100% correct isn't always the right thing. My gut feel, that should be 100% all the time as default, and then I can change it if I don't like it. But that's where we are at the moment. So clicking on the arrow or pressing the apply button, either one would have done that. But be careful with this as well. Actually, there's a little bit of a usability thing here. You see, I hit the apply button again because this is defaulted back to 100. So hit apply. Ooh, why are we doing that? There we go. And now it will stick to the 100. Okay. So we've got our shot here. now I want to feature this line and maybe take some of the distraction away with everything else. One of the ways I can do that is with drama and clarity, and we're going to do that in a second. But the other way actually is I'm going to do it through saturation. So I'm not worried about diffraction in here too much, I don't think. Let's just have a little look. Oops. I'm stuck in a thing that I don't want to be stuck in. That's cool. Okay, let's just have a little look whether our diffraction correction is going to sharpen anything up. Maybe a little bit, so we'll enable it. Okay. Not too worried about sharpness fall off. And I'm looking out here. This is still pretty sharp. That's at 200%. That's at 100%, nice and sharp, same as it is out here. If I did want to make it sharper at the edges, I can turn that up. It's going to do a little bit of a fix, but not too much on this lens, so I wouldn't bother. Remember, the golden rule with some of these things in Capture One: use as little number of sliders as you can get away with. You want to use the least amount possible, not the most possible. There's no prizes or medals for getting the most number of sliders in use. Every slider, assume, is potentially going to hurt your image, and just bear that in mind. Okay, so with our tab here, so instead of going to the exposure tab, I am going to go to the color tab, and I'm going to do something a little bit weird. So we're not going to do it through selective color because I don't think we need to do it that much. What instead I'm going to do, create a new layer and call it light trail. With that layer, we're going to draw a brush, and let's just draw all the way over here. I don't have to be too careful with it because I've selected that area of the image. But now with that area of the image, I'm only going to affect a certain color, which is the reds, the oranges, and the yellows. Now I could select them individually and try and do it that way, or I can pick somewhere in the midpoint. So we've got reds here through to yellows down there. Let's pick on that. Oops, go to advanced first, sorry. Pick on that, and it's chosen this cone of the advanced tool. Now this is where I'm going to tell Capture One, this is the area that I want to be editing in color terms within my mask. So it's almost like you've got layers here. Layers is a bad word because it confuses things, but we've got our base image. We've got a mask that I've drawn, and then on top of that mask, we've got a selection now, which is only this color range. To make the color range a bit different, make it bigger, for example, because I do want to include some of these yellows, so I'm going to pull that arc around, and some of the reds might almost venture into magenta down here. So we're effectively touching this color range on this mask, and we're going to go all the way into the center. So this is saturation. So as it goes from the middle out to the outside, that's saturation, and around the wheel, that's your hue, effectively. So with that, I've now got a separated layer, which I'm going to put the saturation quite a way up, maybe even 75, something like that. Put the lightness up as well, so this starts to look scary. The reason I know I can safely do that is because on my background, I'm going to go to my exposure tab, and I'm going to pull down the saturation overall in the image. So I'm countering. I'm increasing the saturation of that color range in that masked area on top of a background that has now been desaturated. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit weird to sort of get into your head, but we are seesawing here. So what I'm saying is, and don't get me wrong, I could do it a different way. I could manually mask through that light trail, or I could do a filled layer and then remove the light trail from it and so on. But I'm never going to get the intricate parts of these little lines and so on. Typically now with cars with LED lights, you get this sort of, I guess, snakeskin effect as the lights are going by. So that's why I've done it that way. Effectively, is to separate out that red and yellow color on a masked layer on top of a background that is now desaturated. Okay. Then on top, let's go to our original crop, and let's just do a couple of little other things. So number one, I'm going to pull this in from the corner. The reason is, this is fine, but it's a little bit distracting, and I'm not too much of a fan of it. I'd rather have the edge of an image start clean. The good thing with this crop is it started with the whole of this building pretty much in there. Obviously there was more of it to the left hand side as I come out. We could, if we wanted to, make this a bit bigger over here, but you're not going to gain much. I'd just be making sure that we haven't included anything. What we don't want on the edge of a frame is things that are a little speck of light or a final little change of color, a sudden change towards the end of the frame. It looks messy. So we're going to pull this in and make sure that we don't have any of those bright spots or any of the yellow in there at all. And hit the little button there, the little mouse button, and that applies it. Or I could hit enter on the keyboard and it would do the same thing with crop. And that's probably where I'd be. We could, again, this comes down to personal choice. We could, if we wanted to, put a foreground vignette, not a round vignette. I'm just calling it a vignette just for ease. But effectively, a nice little soft fall off here. And I'm just going to pull our exposure down just so that we're leading into that road. Again, personal preference, up to you. And then on here, on these lights, you know, we could get away with a little touch of clarity on the background if we really wanted to make things pop a little bit more. Again, not too much. We do it like this. That clarity boost is going to make those lens flares, or the stars in the lens flare, just glow a bit too much. They're going to start growing, which we don't want. So a little bit of clarity boost, but not too much, really not too much. And then we've got our HDR challenge. So obviously this bit here is lovely and separated out, but down here I'm losing a little bit of detail in some of these windows. So let's just see what we can pull down with our white slider. A little bit, not too much, a little bit, but it does fix this little blowout here. So we've got a little bit of overexposure here, a little bit here, and some in these windows. So let's pull that down a touch. We could pull down our whites just a bit as well. So let's go to before and after. So there's before, there's after. Again, it's all subtle, but at least it's giving you the control over what you see. In reality, we cannot pull detail back from something which is overexposed. If I move my mouse over this spot here, we're at pretty much 255. That's probably only 254 because I've pulled down the highlights and the whites, but there isn't anything extra in there. Michael's just joined from Germany. Morning, or afternoon. Cool, you're ahead of us. So use your highlights and your whites control to pull back detail where you know that it exists, but be conscious that if it is overexposed, you can't do much with it. And then let's do our before and after. So remember, before and after is going to respect our crop. So there is before, there is after. This is literally personal preference as to which one you prefer the tones of. The desaturated sky, some people might prefer the royal blue color of the night sky. I personally prefer this sort of slightly tonal or muted color. If you wanted to boost that again, but leave the rest of it desaturated, easy. All we got to do is let's create a new layer. I'm going to call it sky. And I'm actually going to brush into all of this area up here. Again, don't have to be too careful. You can probably guess why I don't have to be too careful, because we are going to select with our color editor the blue, and we're going to make sure that we get all of this blue in, but that's excluding any other colors in the image. And with that, I can then pull up our saturation a bit if I wanted to, so we can get back to the sky color that we want if we felt that the change wasn't quite right. Personally, I'd almost be pulling the lightness down, actually, having seen that. So we can do that and that. And that to me is quite a funky little edit. So we go from there. It's very vibrant. It's very electric in that sense. But to me, this feels a bit more like a town that you're the only person stood eating your fish and chips, in this case, Claudius. So yeah, that's where I would get to. So Surge, I want to. Oh, we've got 5 minutes. Let's see if we can do something very quickly with this one, because I know what I want to play with in this. It's very quick. So an image. I think you said this is from a city. Oh yeah, City Walk. It's a photo walk in Lux City. So we've got a little bit of a keystone correction to do. Let's see how quickly we can do this one. So our lens profile generic, because this particular lens is an EOS R with a 24 to 240. Okay, it's not profiled yet in Capture One. We don't have the ability to fix it. So we do our chromatic aberration, and not too worried about diffraction on this one. It'll be okay. So first off, keystoning. Let's get things straight, and we can use potentially one of these lampposts to do that with. There, and there on the left. So with that done, let's apply that. Again, the default has gone to 1 or to 80, so we make that change to 100. All good. So we now have our straightened image, which is good, but this image needs something to really boost it, and to me, it needs black and white. So I'm going to immediately go into, in fact, before we do that, I'm just going to pull down some of our highlights and some of our whites. The reason is I want to get some of this detail here on this building back. So here's before, here's after. You see, we've got a little bit more detail and texture and edging on that building. Now, color editor within black and white. So if I go into the color tab and we go to enable black and white, I've got my sensitivity tab down here. We've talked about this in a couple of sessions before, but I'll go over it very briefly. We can choose based on each of the different color channels how bright or how dark they're going to be effectively. It's a bit more complex than that, but that's what it does. Now, if I look at our image, we've got some blue in the sky. We've got some greens, which actually, if you hover your mouse over here and look at those numbers on the top, 87, 152. Well, red and green together make yellow. These two are so close, this is possibly even more yellow than it is green, but it's definitely on the green side of yellow. And we've got some red tones up here, so we're at 111. It's these numbers up here I'm using to reference. So more red than green and blue, and obviously we can see, looking at that, it's red, just like this red car, which gives it away as well. So enable black and white. The blues in the sky, what happens if I darken them? Now I've got some drama in the sky. And what happens if I, let's say, darken down, no, in fact, let's pull up our greens, but darken down the yellows. So these trees and stuff that weren't quite green, they're a little bit warmer than green. We're going to darken them down. That's good. Red, well, we've got this building on the left-hand side we talked about. So we've got a choice. We can either make the building darker, more dramatic, or we can make it lighter and a bit happier. Let's just go for a little bit darker. Magenta, I don't think is doing much in this image. There's not much in the magenta tones. But immediately, I've now got a more dramatic image than just desaturating it. If we just desaturate, which is basically what happens when you tick that enable black and white first, it's a flat change of all of the values to 0 to 255 in one channel, black and white. The second I start playing with these sliders, we've got access to some of the different tones in the image and the colors in the image independently, which is also why, even though I'm now in black and white, if I change my white balance, I'm going to affect the impact of those sliders. So think about it. The cooler I make my image, the more blues there are. So the darker that sky is going to become. So using these together is really, really quite funky. Now, on top of that, what we can do is we can boost a little bit of clarity. And we could also play with our levels just to make that spike nice and bright again up here and pull our shadows into there. That's looking good. If we want to go a bit further, we could go into our Luma, our curve here. In black and white, it doesn't matter really whether I'm on Luma or RGB, but let's just pull that up there. It's looking pretty good. And that's pretty nice as a city shot. So we go from before, nothing wrong with the shot. It's a nice shot of that city. But here to me is a more dramatic, more engaging shot that's got a little bit more of a tendency to make people want to go and walk up to it and have a look. If I just create a new variant so we see before and after, there's our difference. Okay, that was quick, wasn't it? Why can't we do everything so quick? So one question from Serge, isn't the building on the outer right still leaning? You mean this one? I think, is it actually leaning? Maybe, I don't know. What do we think, people? Is that meant to be straight or is it meant to be leaning? Because what's weird is this side here seems to be leaning as well. Let's put it this way. This lamppost is definitely straight. If I put a guide up, let's just add a vertical guide. So this building here is straight. This lamppost is straight. This lamppost is straight. The fact that this building kind of isn't, I wonder whether that building maybe has a, I don't know, a curve, but it just seems, it seems a bit weird. Maybe it's a bit of distortion. Maybe, yeah. Yeah. So Pablo's just just come up on the screen. Looks like barreling. Yeah, because it's the same on here. It could well be. You may all be very, very right. So let's just put a bit of distortion correction in. In fact, we can't do that because it's going the opposite way. Of course it will. It's going to barrel the other way for pincushion effect. We will have to have a play with that. So, let me do you a deal. We're going to end today's session on this picture, and next week we're going to start with this picture because I want to have a bit of a chat with a couple of people about how do we get this to the point where we're doing reverse distortion correction, because we wouldn't normally have that on here. So yeah, that's going to be fun. Next week we will start with this one, and I will hopefully by then try and find a way of fixing our weirdly angled buildings that don't match some of the other stuff. Cool. Right. So that's yeah, this sorry, Pablo's just said, yeah, this building, I'm going with that one is definitely unstraight. I think that's by design. But yeah, we'll have a play. So next week I promise we will start on where we left off with this one, and we'll try and get that a bit fixed, but I'm not sure how exactly we're going to do it with the tools that we've got, but let's have a play. We'll find out. So in the meantime, remember, as I said earlier, that Facebook group is there. Please do join it, engage, interact, send in images with what you've done and what you've processed. Do not send me and into that group or anyone else in that group. Do not waste our time by sending pictures of your dinner with no description whatsoever and just saying, here's another shot. That's not what it's for. It's for engaging, it's for sharing ideas, it's for helping each other. So please use it in that way, and it becomes a positive resource. That is also where we will talk through the plan for our session with David, which is going to be catalogs versus sessions. That'll be over the next week. So I'll put in a note on there on when it is and how we're going to get access to it, because we want it to be, as I say, a bit more interactive. And in the meantime, we talked about some of that stuff today, but there are a load of pro tips sessions on Facebook that you can watch. They're all free. They're about 20 minutes each, and it will cover things like clarity tools and the different modes and so on, but also sharpening and brightness versus exposure and so on. Remember to send in your pictures using that tool. So pori4live.wetransfer.com. That will take you to a place where you can upload the raw. Please, the raw, not the JPEG or the flattened image. And remember to include your name and what the issue is. For those of you that we didn't get to this time, we'll try and pick up on next week. But obviously, we'll start with Serge's image and the correction that we need to do there. And in the meantime, if anyone needs to get hold of me, these are the ways to do it. And we will catch you next Thursday, same time, same place, unless we see you before with David for catalogs versus sessions. Cheers, everyone. Bye.